In the 1st century, after when Christians traditionally date the resurrection, an uproar started in the Jewish communities. People who were claiming to be part of a new cult called Christianity were claiming to be sent by a man named Jesus of Nazareth, but had several disagreements about who this Jesus actually was. This caused several people to write their own Gospels, at around the same time as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A common myth that still goes on in Christian circles today is that the earliest Christians were persecuted heavily for their beliefs. They get this from forged passages in Tacitus' works, the Annals, and other passages like that. But in reality, martyrs were simply witnesses to the faith. That's what a martyr means, a witness. And that's why we have so few records of early Christianity, except for just stories and stuff like that, because there was such division and it's impossible to trace where they actually started. Throughout the first and second centuries, Christians began to bicker and fight and complain about which Gospels were true and which weren't. And since there was not a hierarchy until the late 1st century to the early 2nd, it was left to every common man to write their own and have their own interpretation of what everything meant. But, because of the writings of Paul, Christianity took a very different direction from what its original course was, since Paul has his own ideas about what Christians should believe. And this is very evident in Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he talks about his dispute with Peter. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there were many different competing views of Christ. They all had their own scriptures, and this was the case until one man, Irenaeus, finally laid out what Christians should and shouldn't believe, what sort of heretics they should watch out for, and things like that, which finally started to give our version of Christianity today a little ground. But all competing views of Christ remained, until the 4th century, when Constantine started to make his own version of Christianity, a lot like Paul actually, and he called the council Nicaea. By that time, you had people who thought that Jesus was married, that he was just a man, that his resurrection was purely spiritual, etc. But that all changed after the council, because Constantine had his own views of how Christianity should be. He had ideas of a Trinitarian God, one the belief that Christ was God taught, something that was almost foreign to Christians in the past. The council, all the different sects argued, bickered, until finally it was decided that Christ was indeed God, mostly due to the persuasion of Constantine. Then Constantine decided which books belonged in the New Testament, and he and the bishops chose which ones would help their power the most. After the council, this new orthodox view, the church used its new political power to wipe out all the competing sects. That's when the sacred and the secular had a type of marriage. Constantine wouldn't compromise his paganism, so the church was forced to lower its standards. Had hundreds of new converts, but none of them really liked this Christianity and wanted to go back to paganism. Converts, well, let's just say they didn't have the right tone when it came to Christianity. And so the church had to keep up with the competition in some way. The church began adding things like pagan holidays. They did things like replace patron gods with patron saints. They had what Catholic churches now have as the 7 sacraments. The idea that Christ's body is literally in the Eucharist. Things like that, etc., etc., etc. And from this mixing we have Roman Catholicism, where essentially we have the Roman pagan religions under the veil of Christianity. And this new church started commissioning scribes to add and get rid of all sorts of different parts of the Bible, and they prevented anyone from reading the Bible at all. Well, any lay person, that is. The only exception is the theologians, who were made sure to be brainwashed through their training and interpret every verse in the proper way. But things were about to get worse. These scribes also looked at other ancient texts and found there was no evidence for the Christ outside of their silly little book, So naturally, they started adding their own short but powerful passages. Oh, yeah, and by the way, they were all trained in the art of forging too. So that's why there's no real evidence, well, no hard evidence. I mean, we have speculation and conspiracy theories, which is enough for me. It better be enough for you too, otherwise you're ignorant. So that's why there's no real evidence that they were actually forged. You will just have to take my word for it. But when the church really goes off the deep end is at the beginning of the second millennium, when Christians decided that they needed to go back and take the Holy Land. Pope Urban I thought it to be a great idea, a great way to gain money off of indulgences. After all, he said that anyone who dies in battle will be granted a plenary indulgence, and you need to pay for those. So, indulgences are really just a scam of the church. The holy knights got their armor, their weapons, and their horses, and they rode off to Jerusalem, slaughtering every poor, innocent Muslim, Jew, and sometimes even Christian they encountered. The bloodshed was so amazingly high that the Muslims over there to this day still remember the Crusades as one of the most savage parts of their history, when they nobly defended against those barbaric Roman Catholics. Remember that part. By this time, true Christianity had to work underground to remain hidden from the Romanists killing them. And so these aren't true Christians in the Crusades, these are Roman Catholics. For the next several decades, crusade after crusade after crusade of savage Europeans kept trying to take back the Holy Land, until finally a man named Saladin tried to stop any more of the fighting. He'd seen enough, and he didn't want to see any more. But even when the fighting stopped in the Middle East with Europe, there were yet worse things the Roman Church was doing. It had started inquisitions to torture and get confessions out of anyone and everyone who they considered to be against the Church. And the idea that they didn't agree with was to be thrown out. Even at this time, people, because of what the Church had said, had such a strong belief that the earth was flat, and that it was at the center of the universe that stopped progress in many areas. After all, the Church didn't want any free thinkers. That would be a loss of millions, billions of dollars, which is why the Vatican is still so wealthy today. Which is why they had to persecute every single scientist, and any scientist who tried to think with their own thoughts. It couldn't be afforded. Which is why we have, before the Crusades and after them, a time known as the Dark Ages. For instance, do you know why Columbus had such problems actually being able to sail across the world? It's because people thought that he would fall right off. The Church didn't want their ideas to be questioned. So they tried not to let anyone test if the world was really flat. So they delayed the funding, but eventually they couldn't refuse. They needed to let him sail. And so when he did, and found his way back eventually, people were astonished and started to question whether the Church really did have all the answers. It was the first real victory over the tyranny and oppression of Catholicism. After all, if the Church is wrong about one thing, maybe it's wrong about another. And if it's wrong about another, maybe it's wrong about a whole plethora of other things. Which is exactly what scientists throughout the next several ages would be continuing to find out. But now, we come to the Reformation, when Martin Luther triumphantly began to take on the Catholic Church, and finally true Christianity will once again surface. But the Church wasn't going down without a fight. They launched the Counter-Reformation, in which a new order was founded, the Jesuits. The Jesuits would be the Vatican's main way of controlling people for the next several hundreds of years. And since the Inquisitions were still being used, the Church had to find some way to dispatch these new protesters, or Protestants. They needed to find a way to kill all of them before they became a real threat. And so, they sent out torturers to kill every last one of them. This is especially evident in Spain, where Catholics essentially said to innocent Jews, Muslims, and Protestants who were living there, "Leave or die." But back to the scientists. The best example of anti-science bigotry is when Copernicus published his book on the theory of how the Earth moved around the sun, people didn't believe that this could be possible simply because that was the church's view. It couldn't be. The Earth had to be the center of the universe, and it couldn't revolve around the sun. It had to be stable. That was what the church said. So once again, the church became very angry that someone was questioning her authority. The Pope then placed Copernicus's treatise on the index of banned books, so that no one could read it and find out the truth. When Galileo started to come out in support of his theory, the church needed to find a way to get him silenced. They put him on trial and forced him to renounce his doctrine or die. Eventually, he did, but later he kept trying to prove what he was saying was true. He even set up a telescope and showed it to show to the clergy, but when they arrived, they refused to look, and he was handed over to the torturers. He was killed as a heretic. There he is. This man was a martyr of science. Look on him with great admiration. Even so, people eventually started to read what Galileo and Copernicus had said and concluded that he was actually right. They looked through their own telescopes and came to the same conclusion. The Roman Church was starting to lose control of the situation. People were starting to think for themselves. They couldn't risk losing any more people, but it was already too late. Scientists were springing up all over the place. They were thinking, we can't let them do that. Protestants were becoming too well established, and Americans wouldn't bow down to the Pope either. So after the Enlightenment, the Church decided to launch Vatican I, which stated that it is still the official ruler, and began to slowly cooperate with these new scientific theories. It was forced to accept things like evolution and the idea that the Earth is billions of years old, as well as the universe being billions of years old, of course. It tried to pretend that all this stuff, all this horrible things in the history of the Church had never even happened, which is a burden that all Catholics need to live with up to this day. Or so we're told. I get this story a lot from atheists, cults, Muslims, even several Protestant fundamentalists. If you're a Catholic or an evangelical, you've heard some version of a lot of these different anti-Christian, unhistoric, inconsistent, nonsensical stories. Well, I hear them all the time. It's normally not all put together like this, but there is. I get bits and pieces of them, and they vary every once in a while. I do know. I've known for a while that this is, 93% of all of this is completely false. But I've never really organized it into anything I can simply point to whenever one of these topics comes up. So I've decided to change that. I've decided I'm going to make a new series of videos with the actual history of the Catholic Church is, which will cover even more issues than just the ones brought up in this video. If you hear anyone say anything that has come before this, I would advise you not to take what they are saying seriously, because it is very misinformed, whether they are trying to deceive you or not. What I want to show is, while yes, the church definitely wasn't what it should have been, what people think it's been is far from what it's actually been. Say that 5 times fast. Heck, if you read the books like the Da Vinci Code or just didn't listen to the last 2 minutes of this video, you think the Catholic Church is simply a savage, barbaric, power-hungry, evil organization which will stop at nothing to make everyone in the world worship the Pope. But that's not even reconcilable with history. Not even a distorted view. Well, apparently it is, but most of the time, depending on your distorted view of history, that's not reconcilable at all. So it's high time I organize it into a larger series, since after all, pointing to other people who have done all this before me would be an appeal to authority, and show that I can't make my own arguments.